In a market full of entry-level camera options, the Fujifilm X-T100 certainly stands out in the looks department, but what exactly can it do underneath that sleek exterior? The new Fujifilm X-T100 starts a new line in Fujifilm's X-Series. It's an entry-level mirrorless camera and it sits just above Fujifilm's X-A5 in the range. And in fact, it has a lot in common with the X-A5. The specifications are almost identical. However, there is one major difference that sets them apart, and that's the fact that the X-T100 has an electronic viewfinder, whereas the X-A1 is just reliant on the rear screen. Just like the X-A5, the X-T100 uses an APS-C size CMOS sensor with a 24.3 million pixel resolution. Now, this may seem like the same sensor that's used higher up in Fuji's X-Series cameras, but the difference comes in the sensor filter array. The X-T100 and the X-A5 use a standard Bayer pattern filter array rather than Fuji's own X-Trans array. If you don't know what that means, don't worry, I'll put some links in the description below. But basically, Fuji's X-Trans array uses a different pattern for those tiny red, green and blue filters that sit just above each photo site on the sensor. Now, it's this array that's used higher up in Fujifilm's range on the majority of its cameras, in fact, and it's part of how those cameras get those unique colours. It's part of that Fujifilm colour science that provides photographers with those film simulations that we know and love. But having said all that, the standard Bayer pattern array is used by virtually every other digital camera sensor, so it's by no means a bad thing. But it does mean that we might have to change our expectations slightly when we're looking at the colours that the X-T1 produces compared to cameras like the X-T2, the X-Pro 2, the X-H1, etc. Now, although the X-T100 looks a little bit like the X-T20 on the outside, inside they're actually very different cameras. Now, this comes down to the processing power, and that in turn affects the speed and performance of the camera. So for example, the X-T100 shoots a maximum of 6 frames per second compared to 14 frames per second for the X-T20. The X-T100 has 91 AF points compared with 325 AF points for the X-T20. And finally, the X-T100 has a reduced frame rate when you're shooting 4K. Sadly, it only shoots 4K footage at 15 frames per second. Okay, let's move on to the camera itself. As I've just said, we've got a retro SLR style body with a 2.36 million dot electronic viewfinder. Now, the body of the camera is largely plastic, but it does have an aluminium top plate and dials. Because the aluminium is very light and it's painted, you could actually mistake this top plate for being made of plastic. Now, overall, the camera is very light. It weighs just 440 grams, including the battery and the memory card. Now, by default, there's no grip on the camera. As you can see, the front is almost completely flat, but what you do get in the box is this kind of textured plastic grip, which just screws on the side here. Now, that's a nice addition because usually those kind of things cost a few extra pounds as an accessory, but it doesn't actually add much in the way of bulk to be able to hold onto the camera. Now, you're unlikely to be using the X-T100 with large or heavy lenses, so this isn't going to be an issue for most photographers. However, I'd much prefer to have a larger molded grip, something like you'd find on one of the X-T100's main rivals, the Canon EOS M50. I'd like to see that large grip, even if it did sacrifice a little bit of the camera's style. After all, the X-T2 has a molded grip on the side and it looks absolutely great. Speaking of style, the X-T100 certainly looks the business, and it kind of gives you that illusion that we're shooting with a early 1980s SLR camera. Now, it's available in this finish, which is called dark silver, and then there is champagne gold, and of course you can get it in black as well. Purely from an aesthetic point of view, I think the black version would be my preference. When you get a little bit closer to it, it holds up that illusion that it could be a solid metal body just for a bit longer. Whereas when you get close to this dark silver, sort of when you're looking at it from here, you can actually tell that it's painted metal, aluminium in this case, rather than solid metal. It's kind of a similar story with what looks like this faux leather finish. It's actually rather plastic and it's not too rubbery or anything like that. However, it does offer some texture and grip rather than the kind of smooth finishes that we see on some other mirrorless cameras. Now, layout wise, the X-T100 is excellent for an entry-level camera. I can't state that enough. What we've got here is a program dial, and then there is an exposure dial just here. And then on this side, we've actually got a dial that's a function dial, and it can be used to change any number of settings. Now, I've got this set up to change the ISO sensitivity, and then we've also got another little dial that sits upright on the rear of the camera. So between these three dials, which you can use for exposure, you can change any exposure setting without having to rely on going into the camera's menus. Now, if you throw in the usual rear directional control button, function button just on the top there, and then the quick menu button and quick menu screen, all of the key settings that you're going to want to change are really easy to do so. And we've also got a touchscreen, so there are a few settings that can be adjusted via pressing on-screen buttons. One neat bit of design that I really like on the camera is quite simple, but it's the way the bump pops up for the pop-up flash. Just flips up, push it forward to reveal this small little flash unit. I just think it's really neat the way they've incorporated that. Input wise, we've got micro HDMI and micro USB sockets on the side of the camera. Now, the camera actually charges via micro USB, and there isn't a dedicated battery charger in the box. Now, annoyingly, the battery life is measured in bars rather than a percentage, so you never exactly know how much charge of the battery you've got left. Fujifilm quote the battery life as being rated at 430 images, or 100 minutes of full HD video when you're using face detection, or 170 minutes if you've got face detection turned off. Obviously, in real terms, you can expect to get a lot less than that when you're shooting in real world conditions. You're going to be reviewing the images, and if you're using this kit lens, it's actually got a powered zoom on it, so that itself is going to use up some battery life. Now, because of all of that, I would recommend that anybody using this camera definitely carries a second battery around, or at the very least a USB power bank, so you can charge the battery when it's not in use. Now, the final input on the camera is this 2.5mm socket here, and that can be used to attach a remote release or an external microphone. Now, the rear screen is also touch compatible, so you can use it to change the focus point, and there are a few settings here that you can change simply by touching the screen, such as the picture style there, the film simulation. Now, I found the touchscreen works reasonably well, but there is a tiny bit of lag. But I don't actually think it's the screen itself not being sensitive. It seems sensitive enough. It's more like it takes a fraction of a second to register that you've actually touched the screen. Now, another slight annoyance is that you can't use the touchscreen with the quick menu. So if I press the quick menu button, you've got all these nice large buttons here, but you can't actually change them, then use the wheel. You have to use the directional control to shift it around, and then use the wheel on top to change the settings. Can't use the touchscreen on there. Now, the other thing, other than the AF points, that I used the touchscreen for was changing the film simulation mode. Now, this works well, but as you scroll through, the animation isn't actually very nice, and it kind of just snaps back without any kind of smoothness, if that makes sense. So because of this, it makes the touchscreen feel kind of just a little bit weird, again, like it's not completely responsive. But if you use the directional controls, it just snaps through really nicely. Now, hopefully that can be improved with a firmware update. It's just a little quality of life thing that would make the whole camera seem a little bit smoother just when you're using the touchscreen in that way. Navigating through the camera's menu system is really straightforward, and it's broken down into nice sections. I've not found many options here that are in weird or strange places that are going to catch you out. Everything's quite logical. Now, the final part of the rear screen is that it has two articulations, so it can be tilted up, but the interesting thing about the design is it can also be flipped forward to be front facing like that, and then you can still tilt it up and down, so you kind of get the best of both worlds. If you want to take pictures, you've still got the screen tiltable in line with the lens, which is easier than having it out to the side, but then if you wish to film yourself and do some vlogging, you can still flip it round. I really like the way Fujifilm have incorporated that into the screen. If you want to flip the screen forward and film yourself, you're going to want to know the video features. And first up, 4K, it only shoots at 15 frames per second, so it's very juttery. Usually you want to be shooting at 24, 25, 30 frames a second. My logical explanation, based on the other features of the camera and what we know about it, is that it just simply doesn't have the processing power or probably the heat dissipation because of the plastic body to be able to deal with the demands of shooting 4K video. Now what the camera does do is full HD at 24, 50 or 60 frames per second. Oddly there's no 25 or 30 settings. You do have a maximum record time of 30 minutes, and when you're shooting 720p footage you can do so at 4 times speed, so 100 frames a second, so that you can record slow motion sequences. And when you're in that setting you can record slow motion for up to 7 minutes. Now there are a few catches when it comes to video. Firstly, the 2.5mm socket. Why can't we have a 3.5mm? It would make life a lot simpler. You can obviously get 2.5 to 3.5mm adapters easily enough. They aren't that expensive either. Or another option is Fujifilm's own X-T100 microphone, and that comes with a 2.5mm plug and also a 3.5mm adapter, and that costs around £75. Finally, the file system that the camera uses, FAT32 I believe, and that means that we can only get video clips at 4 GB size. So you can record for a lot longer. You could record 12 GB worth of footage, but they're going to be split into 3 4 GB clips. Not a deal breaker because you can just put them on a timeline and obviously push them against each other. You don't lose any footage, but just a little bit annoying. Now let's cut to a little clip of me doing some vlogging so that you can see just what the video footage of the X-T100 is like. So this is vlogging with the Fujifilm X-T100. Now I'm currently in the 4K 15 frames per second mode, so let's see what this looks like. I'm shooting with the Astia picture style. I've got the screen flipped out just here so I can see myself. White balance is set to auto, and pretty much a lot of the other settings are set to automatic as well, just to see what it's like. I've got the electronic image stabilization turned off, and then of course we've got the optical image stabilization turned on the lens. We're on continuous autofocus, so let's see how well it kind of stays locked onto my face. So now I am recording 1080p footage. All the settings are exactly the same as before. That looks really nice with the sun just coming up over here. And let's see how this does. I'm not noticing much difference on the screen here to the difference in footage. You know, everything still seems to be working in pretty much exactly the same way. Looking at the screen, the colours from the Astia mode, again, I really like them. It seems kind of natural, soft. I think this is definitely what I'd be using if I was shooting video with the X-T100. And again, going to be interesting to see what the internal microphone is like. So I've just looked back on some of the footage that I've shot, and as well as the autofocus just shifting occasionally, I'm also noticing the exposure is kind of jumping sometimes rather than smoothly changing like it should do. We're getting these little sort of just bumps up and down. It's not too noticeable while I'm kind of walking along because the light's changing quite a bit, but again, it's something that you'd expect, just like I say, to have a kind of bit more of a smooth transition than something solid. It's not massively noticeable, but once you kind of see it, you can't unsee it, if you know what I mean. Okay, so let's talk about the autofocus for still images. Now we've got a hybrid sensor here that can do both contrast, obviously, and phase detection AF. The central 35 areas are the phase detection points, and that certainly seems to be the case. They do seem to be slightly quicker, and those 35 points are marked slightly differently when you're looking at the AF points on the screen. Another feature in the AF settings is face detection and tracking, and then we've also got eye detection autofocus. So you can actually set the camera to choose which eye, your left eye or your right eye, that you want it to focus on. Now that's obviously quite handy with still images if you're taking something like portraits, obviously, as you can just say that, you know, the subject's eye, the left eye, is nearer to the frame. We want that to be focused on, and then the camera will do that and it will focus directly on that eye every single time. The focusing system seems to be fast enough for the type of images that most people are going to be shooting with this camera, and I've noticed that when you focus it in the edges, it can just sort of drop off a tiny bit in terms of speed, but again, it's nothing to be too concerned about. because you're not going to be using this camera for the types of images where you're going to require the, super fast focusing like we see in the top end professional cameras. Let's just remember again, this is an entry-level camera for those just starting out. One of the biggest selling points is Fujifilm's color science, and you can use any of those film simulation color styles when you're shooting video. We haven't got any log mode here, and there isn't that fantastic Eterna film style, but personally, as I said in the video clip, I really like using the Astia mode when I was shooting video. Now, before we judge the video features of the X-T100, I think it's really important to remember just who this camera is for. Although Fujifilm has recently jumped headfirst into video with the X-H1 and the introduction of 4K across most of its cameras, the X-Series has always primarily been aimed at photographers. Now also, let's remember the X-T100 is a camera that's entry level. It's designed for people who are just starting out as a first step in the range, and it's understandable that Fujifilm hasn't gone overboard with the video features. Now, it's a capable camera for shooting video, and you can get some nice results straight out the box, but if your main goal is to shoot video, then I think you're probably better off looking elsewhere. However, if you're a photographer that occasionally wants to shoot some video clips, then I think it's going to serve as a good entry point for the video world as well. Just don't expect all of those high-end features, obviously. So with all of that said, let's talk about the most important part of the X-T100. It's still image quality. Now, that 24.3 million pixel sensor is capable of shooting at an extended ISO range of 100 to 51,200. Now, to access the extended settings, which are 100, 12,800, 25,600 and 51,200, you need to be shooting in the JPEG mode, and you also need to be using the mechanical rather than the electronic shutter. Now, as I always suggest, just avoid those top two sensitivities, and the image quality is pretty good. Realistically, ISO 6400 is about as high as I would happily shoot with the camera when I really needed to. But even at ISO 1600, images still look really nice. They've got lots of detail and there's very minimal image noise. Now, as the sensor is almost certainly made by Sony, the dynamic range is pretty good. There's plenty of detail that can be recovered from both the highlight and shadow areas, particularly when you're trying to pull back details in those raw images. Now, it's also worth pointing out here that the camera can actually develop raw images in the camera itself. Obviously, this isn't as comprehensive as editing in Camera Raw or Lightroom, but it's going to help when you're out and about and you just want to tweak an image. Something else that's going to help when you're out and about is the fact the camera has both Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. Now, I've used this, it works really quickly. It took a minute or two to set up and then we were done. I was transferring images from the camera to my smartphone, so I can transfer that raw image that I've just edited, or I can transfer the JPEGs straight over to an app for further editing on my smartphone. Now, I used a few different lenses while I was out shooting, including this, which is the Fujinon XC 15 to 45mm f3.5 to 5.6 OIS PZ kit lens. Now, I found that it's a kit lens. It works about as well as kit lenses do. When you're shooting at lower sensitivities where you can get the most detail, you can get enough out of this kit lens. One thing about the kit lens is we've got a electronic focus ring on the front, and then at the back here, this is actually a electronic zoom, and it's kind of a rocker switch. So pull to the left, pull to the right to zoom in and out. Little bit annoying. I'd prefer it if it was just a manual zoom lens, to be honest. Now, as well as the kit lens, I also use the 10 to 24 wide angle lens and the 50 to 135 telephoto zoom lens. Now, both of these lenses have optical image stabilization. We've got no sensor shift stabilization in the X-T100. There is electronic kind of digital stabilization when you're shooting video though. Now, all of those lenses also have the option to change the aperture on a ring on the lens itself, and I found that works well when combined with the other exposure dials on the X-T100. Now, the 50 to 135mm lens is obviously a big heavy lens to put on what is after all a small light camera. Most people aren't going to be using that lens and camera combination. However, I was really pleased with some of the images that I shot with that lens, and despite the fact it's obviously not paired up perfectly, it worked really well. In terms of colour, the film simulation modes are great as always. Shooting sunsets with Velvia setting was absolutely spot on. Now personally I find Velvia a little bit too vivid for the landscapes that I take. I think everything's a bit Windows 95, just very, very green, very, very blue. I much prefer using the more subtle Astia or even the standard Provia modes, and shooting black and white images actually of the red filter effect, which you can do straight through the camera. It's a nice touch to be able to do that. Now I can't be 100% certain because I didn't have another camera with an X-Trans sensor to compare, but the film simulation modes on the X-T100 just to me don't quite have the same tonal subtlety as on something like the X-T2, X Pro 2. The colours it produces are still great, don't get me wrong there whatsoever, but there is just a subtle difference as to how the colours and contrast are rendered, and that obviously comes down to the fact that we're not using that X-Trans filter array on that sensor. So the Fujifilm X-T100, let's put the looks to one side for a second, and what you find underneath this sleek exterior is a solid performer that's capable of producing excellent images with really fine image quality and low noise levels, even when you're shooting at higher sensitivities. It handles excellently with really good access to all of the key features, and the electronic viewfinder is a really nice addition over the XA5. Now there are catches, and that's the few quirks with the touchscreen, the fact we've only got 15 frames a second for 4K video, and a bit of a basic kit lens that comes with the camera. However, for those starting out, for me the X-T100 sits alongside the Canon EOS M50 as my favourite option for those people that want a viewfinder, but you know, everything that you'd want when you're just starting out using a proper system camera. But in terms of looks and style, the X-T100 wins hands down. In terms of cost and availability, it's available now. It costs £619, and as I said, it comes with this kit lens in that package. So that's it, the Fujifilm X-T100. If you've enjoyed watching this video, we upload review videos, first look videos, technique videos, that kind of thing, around once a week. So make sure you hit subscribe so that you don't miss out on all the latest photo gear news and reviews.